I'm going to get us started so that we have plenty of time to listen to our guests today and have an active Q&A. So good afternoon. I think I know many, but not all the people in this room. My name is Leah Middlebrook. I am the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you on this absolutely spectacular afternoon. I do hope that when people leave this talk, everyone pauses to take selfies under the cherry blossoms. They are just in their moment today. But first, sit with us, join with us, and experience the third lecture in our 2024-25 season of programming devoted to the theme of reimagine. Our events this year highlight the original human superpower, our mind's capacity to transform the world around us via imaginative thought. How might we use the power of the human imagination, the power of human reimagination, to engage creatively and critically with the circumstances of our lives? What new insights and research questions will be uncovered in the reimagining process? And what new, more equitable and nourishing pathways can be forged? Allison Pugh, our speaker today, addresses those questions in our annual Luther S. and Dorothy Cecilia Cressman Lecture. The Cressman Lecture was inaugurated in 1997 with a generous bequest from former University of Oregon anthropology professor and archaeologist Luther S. Cressman. The lectureship's goal is the presentation and illumination of fundamental humanities issues that confront societies centrally occupied with science, technology, and business. Allison Pugh is very well positioned to speak to the interests of the Cressman Lecture, as I will explain shortly. However, before doing that, I would like to just take a moment to express my gratitude and appreciation to the Oregon Humanities Center staff. Associate Director Gina Turner, Program Coordinator Melissa Gustafson, Communications Coordinator Peg Gerhardt, as well as the two undergraduate members of our team, our appreciated student workers, Eleanor and Alicia, who are helping you get settled today. And everyone has just been working so hard and so thoughtfully on bringing this event into being. So well done, friends, and thank you. Occasions such as these, when we gather in community, in person and over the live stream, hello live stream, these occasions to reflect on big questions in community feel more urgently needed and also more affirming now than ever. So thank you to the OHC staff for everything you do to make these meetings happen. We open our events with a land acknowledgement developed by our colleagues in Native American and Indigenous Studies and in consultation with the Grand Ronde and the Siletz tribes. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the University of Oregon, and to the lands now known as Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon, and we express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all displaced and Indigenous peoples who call this place, which we call Oregon, home. We give this land acknowledgement to both publicly honor the long-standing and ongoing relationships Kalapuya and other Indigenous peoples maintain with their homelands, and to remind ourselves and our institutions of our responsibilities and obligations as the bearers of this history. The OHC strives to follow up through our programming, our co-sponsorships, and our fellowships, and you can find more information on our activities by perusing our website and looking through episodes of the UO Today program on YouTube and on SoundCloud. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Allison Pugh. Dr. Pugh is professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on how meaningful emotional connections between people are shaped and impeded by trends such as rationalization, job insecurity, and inequalities of gender, race, and class. Dr. Pugh has been a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, the Berggruen Institute, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. She has also been welcomed as a visiting scholar in Germany, France, and Australia. She is the 2024-25 Vice President of the American Sociological Association. Her most recent book is titled The Last Human Job, The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World, and this came out with Princeton University Press in 2024. It is based on an NSF-funded study of the standardization of work that relies on relationship. We are absolutely delighted that she has joined us today to deliver her lecture, Reimagining the Other Ourselves, Finding the Human in the Age of AI. Please join me in welcoming Allison Pugh.
While we're working on the tech, thank you so much. You can hear me well in the back? Great. And thanks again for spending your, the next hour or so with me, even though this is extraordinary weather for Oregon, I've come to understand. And so I really appreciate that. And I also want to thank Leah and the really tremendous staff of the Oregon Humanities Center. Okay. So, we're all set. In the children's classic, Anne of Green Gables, which, by the way, I'm getting by email 2 chapters a day through this public domain email service, so I'm very involved in Anne of Green Gables right this second. The young orphan Anne, just recently taken in by the stern Marilla, has a conversation about imagination. "I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla," said Anne wistfully. "I've never had an aunt, or any relation at all, not even a grandmother. It would make me feel as if I really belonged to you. Can't I call you Aunt Marilla?" "No, I'm not your aunt, and I don't believe in calling people names that don't belong to them." "But we could imagine you were my aunt." "I couldn't," said Marilla grimly. "Do you never imagine things different from what they really are?" asked Anne, wide-eyed. "No." "Oh," Anne drew a long breath. "Oh, Miss Marilla, how much you miss." This lecture series is devoted to imagination, the original human superpower we hear. It's a fitting theme for the Oregon Humanities Center, as our imagination is shaped and expressed in the stories we tell in literature, history, the arts. And the theme taps directly into concerns that feel increasingly urgent as artificial intelligence informs our world, questions that have been asked for centuries, but that become particularly acute in the age of the machine. Those questions include, let's see if I can get this going. What makes us human? What do humans contribute? Ultimately, what does it mean to be human? We have tried to answer those questions for as long as there have been machines threatening to do what we do. There is a moving line that demarcates human work as more or less susceptible to automation, one we might call the automation frontier. That line has been contested ever since machines were invented. In 1589, Queen Elizabeth I once apparently rejected the application for a patent for a knitting machine, the first attempt to mechanize textile production. "Thou aimest high, Master Lee," she told the inventor. "Consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars." Notwithstanding the Queen's efforts, For a long while, the frontier lay between physical labor and cognitive tasks. People thought technology replaced manufacturing workers, but that the jobs of white-collar workers were safe because they represented what humans could do that machines could not. And after it became clear that machines could do cognitive work, such as, say, mathematical computations or data analysis, well, scholars drew a new line. This time around creativity and synthesis in all kinds of writing and in the arts. But today, contracts, laws, and even novels and poetry are being written by ChatGPT and its successors. So we can certainly criticize that these large language models do so via a kind of theft, relying on what has been written before to come up with text that mimics what they collect, acting like what linguist Emily Bender, who we see here, has dubbed a stochastic parrot. Nonetheless, if creativity is the process of blending what came before if creativity is the process of blending what came before to bring about something new, the capacity to create is clearly not reserved for humans alone. Most recently, the latest debate centers on social-emotional skills, with scholars arguing that such skills, such as those found in leadership, cooperation, and empathy, form the basis of a new frontier. This, I think, is closer to the right answer, but as it is, I hope scholars have drawn this line in chalk because they will have to erase it again, and very soon. Socio-emotional AI research has been burgeoning for the past decade, with engineers designing everything from AI couples counselors to virtual preschool. Of course, many of these forays remain in the lab, and critics caution against believing too much of the hype about AI's capacities to disrupt caregiving and other interpersonal jobs. But since ChatGPT burst onto the scene, large language models have taken mechanized empathy to a new level. For example, chatbots have been designed to teach, provide therapy, and give medical advice, in each case, allegedly better than humans. The automation frontier is not going to stop at socio-emotional skills. So, well, if not there, then where? Is the only future we can imagine for humans in an AI world one where we have to choose, as one engineer famously put it, between being pets or livestock? The answer is no. And indeed, I would say it's a failure of our imagination to despair in this way. The problem, as I see it, is that we have characterized what humans contribute as a skill or a trait that belongs to an individual. And instead, I argue that what makes us human can't be found in the individual, a fact that's actually kind of difficult for us to understand, let alone measure. What makes us human is our relationship, our connections, the social web that we create with each other. As Charles Cooley once said, alone, we are like fireworks without a match. So I spent 5 years investigating work that relies on relationship, talking to therapists, teachers, physicians, and others, tracing the common threads in how and why they connect to others, and along the way, discovering a slew of contradictions. Their work offers solace and dignity, and yet it's extremely dangerous, threatening well-being and risking harm. Their work requires that people feel safe in vulnerability, and yet its impact depends on people incurring the risk of judgment. Their work generates profound meaning for themselves and others, and yet it is disrespected, ignored, or taken for granted by employers who who make it hard for them to do it well. So it's vital, I think, that we learn what we can about this work in its promise, its peril, and its paradoxes, and this is my task for you today in this talk. And this reckoning is vital because in our ignorance, we are allowing AI to pose an existential threat. When we think of workers as individuals, we think about how innovations like ChatGPT might monitor or replace them. What is at risk, however, is more than an individual's privacy or his or her job, but instead the connections that are the mutual achievement between and among people. These are the unrecognized stakes of the automation frontier. So what exactly are we talking about here? I'll give you an example from my research. I'm not going to give you that yet. Go back there. Erin was an apprentice chaplain in an East Coast hospital whom I was lucky to shadow as she did her work. She's a tall, middle-aged white woman with chunky jewelry and a very direct and kindly manner. And she was at the end of a long year, one filled with weekly sleepless nights on call and intense sessions with peers and supervisors to process fully what she was experiencing on these shifts that were full of sorrow and death. And one day, I was in the room while she visited with Jordan, an African-American patient, and his wife Mariah in their shared hospital room. And Jordan had brain cancer, a terminal diagnosis. But he was chatty with Erin when she sat down with him. And Jordan mostly complained to Erin about his medical care. He said he didn't want radiation. He said, there's no cure. I should be able to choose whether or not to do anything. Just keep on moving to the next person. And they brought him the wrong specialist. Why are you sending me to a heart doctor? He don't know nothing about the brain. And they kept getting his medication wrong, he said. So I observed also Mariah as she sat kind of quietly to the side, and her eyes were askance and her face was kind of closed, and she shook her head without meeting Erin's eyes when the chaplain asked her if there was anything she could do to help her during this difficult time. And I got the sense that she was not that interested in or hopeful about whatever help this white stranger was thought she was going to offer her. But when they all stood up to pray, they clasped their hands in a circle in what was clearly a familiar ritual for all of them. Erin showed the couple how closely she had been listening. She said, help these people get the best medicine he needs, and help them get more focused care from their care team, and help him ease his frustrations, and help them both as they go through this journey. Pretty simple, but reflecting exactly what he said. So Jordan says a quiet amen to Erin when she finished, but as I watched, Mariah's face completely opened up at this moment. She kind of brightens really dramatically and smiles very, very widely. And, Erin's spoken prayer told Jordan and Mariah that she had heard not only the specifics of his complaints, but also their emotional meaning. And she reflects this understanding back to them directly without showing any impatience or skepticism about his litany. So for Mariah, in that moment, it seemed like her words seemed to resonate like a church bell. So as this example shows, and as many practitioners told me, the crux of this labor involves seeing the other and reflecting that understanding back. And many workers, from therapists to coaches to teachers to managers to personal assistants to sales staff, many depend on this practice. It involves some form of empathic listening and reflective witnessing and regulating your own emotions to get out of the way of hearing and understanding the other. But most important, this process is deeply interactive, not least because for it to land successfully, the other person has to assent to some degree with the vision that's being reflected that way. their way. So this interactivity is a crucial distinction and something that differs, I think, from common knowledge to date, in which emotions are a particular skill or a trait attached to an individual or an intelligence, such as emotional intelligence or EQ. Instead, what's important about seeing the other isn't at an individual level, but it actually takes place between people. So I call this work connective labor, to capture this mutual achievement. And I define it as the forging of an emotional understanding of another person to create valuable outcomes. And its outcomes are indeed valuable. Reviewing a battery of randomized controlled trials, medical researchers have found that the patient-clinician relationship has a detectable effect on health, an impact that they described as stronger than that of taking aspirin to ward off heart attacks. In therapy, we know from research that the connection between the counselor and the client even outweighs the particular version of therapy that is used. This work is also increasingly prevalent. By some accounts, the US is moving from a, quote, thinking economy to a, quote, feeling economy. Labor economists debate whether jobs emphasizing such soft skills have increased because new jobs like wedding planners or social media marketing do they take up a greater share of the US economy? Or is it that the old jobs have more soft skills within them? And they've actually done a lot of studies to try and tease that apart. And then the general consensus, as I understand it, is that both are true. In other words, the feeling economy is even bigger than we thought, than if you just consider the new jobs. And it extends well beyond interactive care work, which by some estimations is about 12% of the US economy. But despite its ubiquity and its importance, connective labor is essentially invisible, only partially understood, and not usually recognized, reimbursed, rewarded. Its benefits have long eluded measurement, making them easy to ignore, while the capacity to connect to others has long been presumed to be innately feminine, making it easy to devalue in women's caregiving work, and to disregard or downplay in jobs where men predominate, such as management or the law. So philosophers have written about the importance of seeing the other, of course, from Levinas writing about the moral authority of the face of the other, to Simone Weil, excuse my butchering these pronunciations, I have no idea how to pronounce these names. You know, a reader vocabulary instead of a, anyway, yeah. Their notion of the attention without ego, kind of, they wrote empty, waiting, and open to receiving the other. And to Judith Butler's concept of being awake to what is precarious in another life, which she considers the chief critical task of the humanities today. Yet we are also, despite this chorus coming from philosophy, we are also in a historical moment today of intense individualism, a neoliberal period shredding the social contract of the mid-20th century and dating back to certainly when Margaret Thatcher announced there is no society, there are only individual men and women and families. And I actually think this trend of this kind of intense individualism, which you can find in so many ways, you all are thinking about examples, I hope, in your heads, are best epitomized by technology trends. I teach a family class and a sociology family class, and this is like a perfect example. If families used to all gather around one TV in the living room, all watching the same thing, you could, and the reason why we know that, in addition to the fact that we know that that just happened, is commercials, advertising were aimed at all of them. So an example, we have Fred Flintstone selling Winston cigarettes. But today, is captured by the other picture. Individual screens allow marketers to target buyers as young as toddlers on their own. So this is relevant because our incapacity to counter the triumph of neoliberalism both contributes to and reflects our very inability to grapple with what happens outside of the individual. And that's really what I'm asking you to do with this concept, is think about what happens between people. So, in fact, even our understanding of the value of connective labor reflects this particular myopia. It's common to characterize its benefits using an injection model, where teaching or nursing or counseling involves me putting my expertise into you. But therapists, doctors, teachers, they know there is more to this work than simply downloading information. And instead, it is the relationship that matters. So what I'll reveal today is what I learned about this work and how it helps us to answer these long-standing questions. And for this project, I interviewed more than 100 people, most who practice, supervise, or analyze connective labor, including mostly therapists, physicians, and teachers, but also including a raft of working class occupations, including hairdressers, sex workers, detectives. I also interviewed people who supervised, evaluated, or tried to automate this work, from administrators to engineers working with robotics and AI. And I also conducted more than 100 hours, actually hundreds of hours, of observation of clinical visits and classrooms and conferences, watching connective labor in multiple sites in California, in Virginia, and briefly in Japan, and also Massachusetts too. Observations included, for example, just to give you a little slice of this, was like 6 months watching physicians, nurses, and patients in an HIV clinic. A semester spent observing the training of school counselors, many hours observing videotaped therapy sessions with with trainee therapists. So I was watching the therapist, the videotape, and then the two or three trainees, and then their supervisor while they commented on the videotape. And that's often how therapy is trained. I also spent a weekend in a horsemanship workshop, which I think you have a picture over there, where med students were being taught about the doctor-patient relationship, and a bunch of other examples, but yeah. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that, methods in the Q&A. So the first question I'm going to answer is, what does connective labor do? And I'll start with Bertie Mueller. So when Bertie Mueller, a white nurse practitioner, thought about what she cherished about nursing, it was the human element of being present with others, she said. I think we all just want acknowledgement of our sufferings, even if you can't cure it or do anything about it, she told me. She still remembered when a homeless man came into her clinic from being on the streets for years, his back hunched, feet gnarled and calloused, and she just sat and did wound care for his feet. Washing his feet captured, she said, what nursing was about for her: the humility, the service, the witnessing. She said, just to give him that moment of, I'm seeing you, I'm acknowledging you, this is me caring for you, she said. It was powerful for both of us. When people see one another, it helps to create dignity by conveying simply that they are worthy of being seen by another person. Another example, Mariah Dreyfus ran a program that taught entrepreneurial skills to ex-inmates by having them meet with mentors in small groups. And she said, and what's interesting is that it takes a while for our entrepreneurs to begin to feel comfortable having that much attention on them, she told me. Like, they ask, you mean you just want to know about what I think? Like, we're just going to be talking about what I want to do? The program helped to transform the men through the power of human attention. But it is not just those who are seen by others that benefit. Practitioners experience their own shared humanity through their connections to their clients or patients. So Gerard Giuliano was a white male therapist, and he was very straightforward with me about his work's reward. He said, I'm really able to kind of automatically put myself in other people's shoes and understand where someone else is coming from. And in doing that, I think it made me someone that people would turn to with a problem or a dilemma. To me, it's always been a real privilege for someone to self-disclose to me. That means a lot. In addition, humans motivate other humans, as many teachers and physicians told me. So your low back pain and your willingness to go to a physical therapist, or your willingness to work on your sleep, said Rebecca Rooney, a primary care physician. After they just had a session with me, people say, I don't know what just happened there, but I feel better and I'm motivated and I trust you and I'm not sure what it was, but I'm ready to work on my health. And she smiled as she told me, I feel like I just told you my secrets. Pamela Murray was an African-American middle school teacher, and she told me that as a child, she had selective mutism, and her teacher took the time to find out that, why she wasn't speaking, and that she wasn't speaking as a response to her own family moving incessantly, spending only months in a particular place. She said, kids get us talking to them all the time, but not listening. And that's what she did. Just listened. Just sat and just listened, and that made a world of difference. I could have been tested and put into special ed. Instead, I was tested and put into gifted and talented. And that relationship inspired her own exhaustive efforts to connect with her students. She works in an Oakland middle school now. She said, I thought, I want to be that teacher for my middle school kids. I want to be the teacher that I wanted and that I needed and that I finally got. So the power of human attention to inspire others may be a truism, but it is perhaps less well known that these effects go both ways. So a primary care physician, a pediatrician, Jenna Marchand, said, it's a trusting relationship. That trust imbues the relationship with almost like a power, a sanctity. There's just something about it. I feel really honored and really lucky that I get to do that. It gives me just as much as I give to people. Finally, people help others better understand themselves. So Bert Juster was a school principal, and he said, I think each kid needs to be seen, really seen. I don't think a kid really gets it on a deep level. I don't think they are really bitten by the information or the content unless they feel seen by the person who's teaching, the person they're learning from. And then Vivian Vaughn, an Asian American middle school teacher, told me she thought of this dimension as where's your line, helping students to figure out who they were and who they were not. We need others to be our mirrors. So these kinds of results, dignity, purpose, understanding, are profound for the individuals involved, both sides of the desk, as it were. But seeing others can also have broader impact, helping keep despair at bay, helping stitch together a sense of shared communal understanding. These social goods are rooted in the relationships forged. On the one hand, we know, a sense of feeling invisible clearly animates working class rage in many countries, for example, and may have powered Donald Trump to victory in the US last fall. In the election aftermath, one op-ed declared, "Voters to elites, do you see me now?" On the other hand, a recent study of formerly incarcerated people in Chicago found that interpersonal recognition from local community leaders helped them feel that they fit in. One ex-inmate said, "She knew now that I have something valuable to say." We each have this thin connective tissue called fascia that holds our bones and our organs and our muscles in place. Seeing each other creates the fascia that anchors our social world. As Sarah Ahmed wrote, how we feel about others is what aligns us with a collective. Indeed, it is through how others impress upon us that the skin of the collective begins to take shape. The power of connective labor, especially in the mundane, everyday world of commerce and civic society, is in its capacity to knit together communities of disparate souls. In other words, to create belonging. Connective labor relies in part on human imagination because we can never truly know the other in our midst. When people bear effective witness to someone else's experience, they are not saying, we recognize what you are feeling, but only because we have had the exact same experience. As the actor and writer Anna Deavere Smith wrote, that genuine moment, that real connection is no small thing. She asks, is it a moment that can happen only when we don't know each other, when we have so much to learn about each other that we hang on every breath together? It is hard to find those moments in our culture because we think we know so much about each other. Those moments are, in fact, all about that which is not predictable. Yet relying on human imagination is also risky, as it is messy, fallible, and as inclined to go wrong as it is to go right. The fundamental unknowability of another human being led social theorists like Foucault and Judith Butler to argue that seeing the other involved a certain symbolic violence in which we fit others into pre-existing boxes that we carry around with us under the label culture. And as Fanon contended, if the boxes are shaped by racism or sexism or the other inequalities that define our world, then what we force onto the other is a form of misrecognition that can inflict real harm. So people told me about those harms in every interview. A physician remembered when she lectured an obese teenager about drinking sodas after having spent years with him building his trust, and then she never saw him again. A therapist recounted when a client felt betrayed by her question about their commitment to a sick partner. A teacher recalled mishandling a student who was going through a rough time, frequently triggering a shouting match that would end up in the student's removal from the classroom. And people also talked about their experience on the receiving end of these kind of misrecognition experiences. In the medical students in the horsemanship workshop, there was a group of medical students at one point listening as one of their classmates recounted in this kind of high and warbling voice her own history as an adolescent patient living through 5 years of painful pelvic exams until her doctor finally saw her expression and called it off for the day. And her expression was, I can still see it, very tight with the memory, and she pleaded with them, just look in their faces. At stake in these encounters is not just hurt feelings, but even health and well-being. So reproductive justice scholar Patrice Wright tells the story of Courtney, an pregnant African-American woman who was on a prenatal visit when the doctor made some comments about her keeping the weight off and about the government's WIC program, a food subsidy for poor mothers and children. And the comments revealed to Courtney that the doctor assumed she was receiving WIC assistance, didn't know basic nutrition, and would tend to gain too much weight. But Courtney was a graduate student who may have been low income but was not receiving WIC, knew a lot about nutrition, and was not overweight. And she felt profoundly unseen and did not return to the doctor. And the stress and anxiety and anger from encounters like these plausibly contribute to the weathering phenomenon and the maternal health disparities documented amongst women of color. So misrecognition matters, particularly for marginalized populations. So as these stories indicate, connective labor involves inherent risks. Because humans meet humans in these moments, their backgrounds intrude. Prior understandings shaped by inequalities that determine who is on which side of the desk. by who is the practitioner and who is the client, all these erstwhile meanings drift into the witnessing moment like clouds of steam, making it harder for people to see each other in ways that might diverge from these pre-existing definitions, these cultural boxes. Yet some conditions, particularly those involving time pressure, stemming from the push for productivity and exacerbated by systems that apply an industrial logic to this work, make those clouds more likely. So as connective labor increases in importance, and to be sure in labor costs, it is increasingly being subjected to new systems that try to make it more efficient, measurable, reproducible. At best, firms implement these systems assuming that such interventions will not get in the way of workers and clients connecting. At worst, they ignore or dismiss those connections altogether. And even these complex interpersonal jobs are facing efforts to gather information and assessment data and to introduce technology. Moneyball has come for connective labor. Teachers have long complained about standardized testing and surveillance, but it is not just teachers anymore. I listen to scores of workers in many fields talk about the spread of counting and scripting. Like Valerie Clausen, a hairdresser in Virginia, and she said, they set a timer and they tell you, okay, you can only talk for this long, and if your service time is slowing down, then stop the talking and get to doing what you need to do. You know, sometimes you need to stop and make real live contact with somebody, not just through the mirror, if you're into that deep of a conversation. And they really don't want that to happen. Everything put together is 22 minutes. That's all you've got. It doesn't matter what, 22 minutes. We can certainly have sympathy for the goals underlying these changes. In the past, in part, the new systems aim for a society where getting a good teacher or a doctor or a hairdresser is less dependent on being lucky or affluent. Research finds that standards, checklists, manuals can confer greater legitimacy upon many kinds of service work and improve upon incompetence and discrimination, while also protecting workers from demanding or chaotic situations and clients. But research also shows that the standardization of this kind of work threatens creativity and autonomy, transforms clients and patients into industrial objects themselves, and demoralizes workers, alienating them from their own feeling. More than 50% of physicians say they are burnt out by data entry requirements. In a Gallup survey, about half of teachers and nurses reported experiencing high levels of job-related stress. Changes in the way we organize connective labor are extracting enormous costs. If there is a battle over the systematization of feeling work, we may have already conceded it when it comes to teachers and low-wage service workers like Valerie. But scripting and counting is invading other relational professional work, even therapy. When Sarah Merced, a therapist at a VA hospital, talked about the mandated treatment plan decreed from above, I was struck by her wistfulness. I guess my wish as a clinician would be able to use some actual clinical thinking. I went to school for many years to kind of figure out what best treatments work for most people. And so it would be lovely to be able to choose when to use these tools and when not, versus having them mandated. Furthermore, when efficiency campaigns exert productivity pressure, conditions encourage people to cut corners on relationship building, resorting to shortcuts and stereotypes. Practitioners are often rushed or overloaded in settings that serve low-income people who do not get the artisanal connective labor that some affluent people make sure to secure for themselves. Studies have shown that time constraints lead doctors to be more aggressive in their diagnoses of white patients and less so when it comes to black patients, for example. Time pressure, patient load, overcrowding, these all exacerbate implicit racial bias, research has shown, making it more consequential in physician decision-making, for example. The risks of misrecognition also mean that to some people, the risks are not worth it. When sociologist Frieden Bloom studied a school serving mostly black low-income boys, for example, he found that while some sought respect or dignity, others actually wanted to be unknown, and urged strongest among those boys with prior formal contact with the criminal justice system. To them, relative anonymity felt like a privilege, the privacy of being free from others' presumptions, a way of belonging to their communities without the mark of a criminal. In another study, teachers who used individual, personalized relationships to deliver support were viewed by some high school students as trying to know my business. Even while they appreciated the teachers' willingness to extend themselves and their interest in students as individuals, many of the students were wary of teachers managing their sensitive personal information. I'm here for science, for math, and you're trying to know me, said Lupe, a 17-year-old. Yet, alongside those who express skepticism, there are also many others who look to be witnessed, hunger to be seen, yearn to tell their stories to those who will listen. And most practitioners I talked to reported what felt like a vast need for reflecting work among the people they see. They felt that the people they met were desperate for their witnessing gaze, and further, given their own finite resources, that they could never effectively meet that need well enough. Students, patients, and clients might not like judgment, but they were nonetheless picky about who was doing the seeing, and they seemed to want providers who might judge. So Jenna, a pediatrician, said she faced enormous need on the part of her patients who appeared to want only her to bear witness to their struggles. She said, so many other people could do that, she told me. Anybody could do that, but the patients don't want just anybody. They want me. And at that point, I made some noises about how perhaps patients were responding to her uniquely empathic abilities, and she demurs. She says, it's just that one of the values society has placed on doctors is that somehow our ears are magical listening ears, and that when we hear the story, we're going to magically extract whatever needs to be extracted and give it back to them in a way that's going to make everything better. The very thing that they were afraid of, her judgment, is what made her connective labor powerful, what gave her magical listening ears. The magical listening ears of doctors, teachers, and the like come as a result of their training and judgment, and thus carry with them a risk, training and experience, and thus carry with them a risk of their judgment. And that possibility, the underlying risk of shame, lends a little frisson of peril to the encounter. So the emotional intensity of the experience is related to the intensity of the perceived risk. And here is where AI enters the scene. For some, machines solve the problems of shame, stigma, and unpredictability. First of all, people widely consider bots or apps as a judgment-free zone. They are routinely more honest with computers than with humans. This surprising fact is one that researchers keep looking for and finding again and again. Adults will disclose more to a computer about their sexual practices before they give blood. They'll tell a computer more about their financial troubles. Children are more willing to disclose that they are being bullied to a computer than to a person. And these findings recur even though machines are not private and they are not anonymous and they definitely judge people, as anyone subject to insurance rates or bank loan terms as computed by algorithms might report. But for some, those judgments don't feel like the moral gaze of another person. In addition, humans give the benefit of the doubt to machines. Researchers have repeatedly found that if programs or robots signal any kind of understanding or relationality in the most rudimentary way, people will approach them as if they have feelings or empathy. As MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle points out, roboticists have learned those few triggers that help us fool ourselves. We don't need much. We are ready to enter the romance. A recent report on chatbot therapy is typical. On the one hand, some users complained about how the app's imperfect witnessing made them feel invisible, but others suggested that people can indeed feel seen by the machine. Said another, "This app has treated me more like a person than my family has ever done." A few years ago, the engineer Tim Bickmore created a virtual nurse, an AI program to help low-income patients at Boston Medical Center with discharge procedures, hoping that it would enable them to understand sometimes long and complicated instructions. And the virtual nurse, whom the coders dubbed Louise or Elizabeth, was no more than an animated figure on the screen, the mechanized voice asking viewers if they were Red Sox fans before going over the after-hospital care plan. Bickmore reported that 74% of his low-income patients preferred a discharge AI agent that he named Louise to a human nurse. Why? Because the program let them go slower than would a busy clinician. "I prefer Louise. She's better than a doctor. She explains more, and doctors are always in a hurry," one patient told Bickmore. Providers spend an average of 7 minutes with patients at discharge, while studies have shown that low literacy patients need more like an hour. The appeal of judgment-free tech is strong, particularly for disadvantaged people. There's a hidden fallacy here, however. In these heady days of the proliferation of empathic chatbots, it is tempting to believe that machines can do this work of seeing the other and that any imperfections are momentary blips on their way to being ironed out. But first of all, there are two problems. First of all, therapists say that if people seek only to avoid shame, say by opting for an AI therapist or companion, then they might never be free of it. Although shame is piercing in human interactions, it is something to walk through together rather than run from. I think this argument is true, but probably a tough sell to ask people to face down their shame. But nonetheless, there is a crucial fallacy at work here, and that is that judgment is the problem. Most important, as we have seen, the power of human connective labor actually, ironically, tragically, rests in part on the very judgment that people fear. So if you get rid of the risk of judgment in connective labor, you also get rid of its very profound impact. So even technologists understand that judgment-free automation has a cost. That of removing the power of aspiration, of someone wanting to do better. And engineers know this well. It's one of the things that makes engagement drop off in most apps after the first few weeks. And here's what it looks like. This trend, which I think is like a 75% drop off or something, is exemplified by user reaction to an AI exercise coach. As one of the testers wrote, Laura was very repetitive, so it was actually more motivating in the beginning to talk to her than later on. She would go through the same routine every single time. And as a result, I didn't feel obligated. I didn't feel like I had to impress her in any way. When I asked Peter Almond, the engineer, what he thought humans still had to offer in this work, he said, "An audience that matters." In his view, robots would someday do most everything humans could do. In education, for example, that included grading papers and answering questions about the material. He still wasn't sure, however, if one could, quote, project enough humanness onto a robot that you want to make it proud of you. These engineers are onto something here, something that therapists and others have repeatedly warned about. And emotional experiences that people might have with AI agents or bots are deceptively filling. Like a hollow illusion, that people nonetheless seem to embrace and that may then have implications for their relations with other people. If social media researchers suggest Facebook offers a form of social snacking that helps people tolerate the absence of in-person social interaction, we might call these shallow experiences with therapy bots, etc., emotional snacking. Users who abandon apps and agents are a symptom of a larger phenomenon, that of tech that incentivizes shallow connections to avoid judgment through emotional snacking. The point is not just that, oops, sorry, I went too fast. The point is not just that this kind of emotional snacking might be bad for you, but rather it has implications for our relationships with other humans. Even if bots evolve to the point of being really effective mirrors, what is missing when it is a bot that sees us is the messiness, the unpredictability, the spontaneity of interacting with another human, all aspects that force us to develop flexibility and compromise, humility, and adaptability. These are muscles that we need to exercise. Furthermore, the very unpredictability of the other is part of the risk of connective labor that lead to its potent reward for ourselves and for our communities. Without friction, there is no fire. So connective labor is a uniquely human practice made more powerful when humans do it. We know that it has profound impact on people, helping to create dignity, purpose, understanding, and to forge relationships that knit our communities together. But it also has serious problems, among them misrecognition, shame, vulnerability. People report that they find bots convenient, cheaper, less judgmental, and sometimes even warmer than humans, who reflect all the time constraints and efficiency pressures that many lament. Somehow, we have found ourselves at a particularly absurd moment in the industrial timeline when people are too busy for us while machines have all the time in the world. We are at a critical juncture right now when the decisions we make or fail to make will affect the trajectory of connective labor. On the one hand, we are in an AI spring, a wondrous moment in which AI is transforming our world, leading to unprecedented advances in biology and linguistics and et cetera. But thanks to the corrosion of connective labor, AI is also being deployed as an alternative to human witnessing in fields from therapy to teaching to medicine and so on. The contemporary degradation of connective labor, in which physicians and therapists work in increasingly sped up conditions that encourage rushed and dismissive scripts, rushed, dismissive, or even scripted interactions, is directly linked to technologists' arguments that apps and AI can solve problems of connective labor. But if we opt to script this work and to respond to workers' inevitable alienation with apps and AI, we cannot then be surprised by what I call a depersonalization crisis, which is what happens when people feel profoundly invisible, a phenomenon with powerful political effects. Turning to tech replacements for socio-emotional work is also likely to have other serious consequences, including the radical shrinking of the connective labor workforce, the spread of fairly shallow, judgment-free services that prioritize information over relationship. In education, we might call that likely outcome Cliff Notes degrees, the extreme stratification of human contact with personal connective labor as a luxury, and the loss of human-to-human bonds that underlie our civic life. In this freewheeling era of so little regulation, when the tech industry fights back every criticism with accusations of being against progress or being a Luddite, it can be difficult to differentiate between what is valuable and what is not in the field. But we can commend some uses of new technology while discouraging others. In my research, I found several examples of clinics and schools that relied on tech to be sure, but who already had what we might call a social architecture that enabled them to prioritize recognition. We can call for a transparency in the use of AI across commerce and civic life and in clinics and in classrooms. We can implement a connection criterion in which we evaluate technology by how much it replaces, impedes, or enables human relationships. But ultimately, even if machines were to do connective labor well, why would we want them to? Among the myriad human activities that we might disrupt or free ourselves from, it is not clear to me why we want to mechanize the relationships that give life meaning and that help us understand our own humanity. In fact, the presence of machines in this work helps to clarify just what is human about it and about us. Seeing others and being seen is the beating heart of human experience. It involves imagination, danger, and vulnerability, coming to terms with the unpredictability of our fellow humans and risking the possibility of connection. It is how we understand ourselves, create connection, forge community, conduct democracy. It is what makes us human, what we have to contribute, and ultimately, what it means to be human. Thank you very much.
I am sure that there are questions. So I'm going to ask people to, as your thoughts coalesce and you realize what it is you would like to ask, I'll come over with a microphone. So just go ahead and raise your hand. And do you want to call on people and I'll do the commuting?
Yeah,
okay.
I can do it.
I'll just offer an example and maybe you can comment on it. I'm in language education. Thank you very much for this talk, but I want to say first, but my focus is on language education and I've been following closely the difference between language learning with an individual coach, for example, or a teacher versus what they're trying to do with AI, where you're able to talk back and forth with an AI assistant. And the huge difference between the two that I see is exactly what you're talking about, is that with a human, they know right when to pause, when to give you time to think of something, when to slip you the right word, when to give you that feedback, or, and how to help you in those moments of connecting and understanding what you're trying to say. Mm-hmm. And the AI bot cannot do that at all yet.
Yeah.
It takes your input, it processes it, it gives you something back, possibly evaluative, but it is not at all that web of back and forth communication. And I don't know, will they be able to do that? I don't know if that's possible, and why would we want to? So like you said, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that with language learning is such a human interaction.
Yeah.
That scaffolding of building that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I didn't know that about kind of bots in language learning. I do know that I imagine that language learning itself is at risk because of the spread of kind of instantaneous translation. Maybe not, I hope not, but it seems like at least translation work is, Yeah, and I completely hear what you're saying. I can tell you what an engineer would say, because I interviewed a whole bunch of them. They would say it's a matter of time. They'll get better. And so in my work, I always tried to think, in addition to how inadequate it is right now, I also tried to think like, well, what if they're right and someday it won't be inadequate? What do we think then? And that's part of the reason why I care about that inadequacy now and think some of these inventions are happening because they don't actually care about, the people inventing them don't actually care about the human work that it's replacing. So that's a deep problem. But also try and think about the fact that it's like, what do these interactions create? It's that in-between space that I want us to articulate and think about, in addition to the loss of kind of language learning or, kind of whatever's happening right now. I also want us to think about, even if it did it perfectly, what would we think? Yeah, and I think it's a loss. Yeah, I think these connections make these extra social goods beyond their stated purpose. And I want us to think about that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, oh, well, she's got one, and then you.
Starting your talk with the sort of history of automation in labor makes me wonder, and certainly many highly unionized fields have been automated.
Yeah.
You spoke about teachers and nurses in particular,
Yeah.
among others. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the role of the labor movement in protecting connected labor.
Thank you for that question. Great question. I need to know more about it. I guess so much labor union, organizing history that I know of is stuck in like kind of thinking about manufacturing, but service labor organizing is a place of hope in America, and but even so, it's such a tiny percentage. So I do think that I've been watching unions and kind of interacting around AI. Like I've been watching, there was a major strike of, I think, longshoremen in Oakland, where they were actually talking not only about automation, but also about the use of AI. And of course, there's the Screen Actors Guild and the whole actors and writers, and they were this was a very central kind of point of contention. So I think the labor movement feels like a really vital player here. But I've also talked to people who, it almost feels like they're assuming the inevitability of it. I think it's very hard to fight against the hype of inevitability, and sometimes it also convinces labor organizers who then try and just get kind of victories along the margins, I would say, instead of saying no completely. It's very hard. So I think there's no way we can push back against the billions of dollars that is being invested, not just in these companies or in these inventions, but also in the marketing and the hype about them, without some kind of collective action. And some of that collective action is going to rely on labor organizing, to be sure. But I wrote this book to reach kind of regular people. What does that mean? To reach people as consumers or as students, or like all kinds of people, to try and highlight what's happening, what's coming, give them a language, that kind of thing. So kind of the broader public, I guess. But I think you're completely right in pointing to the labor movement as an important role. Thanks. There was this gentleman here, and then this one up here.
Thank you very much. My comment might be a bit out of, I wasn't born here, I didn't grow up here, but when arriving here, this problem seems to predate any technology. My shock is to discover a society that was extremely regimented before technology. I mean, everything is mediated through, do you know how to fill a form? And all the rapports have been streamlined already in advance about filling a resume, filling a job application. How do you audition for a job interview? where the whole dialogue is scripted.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is artificial from the very beginning. You know, how your life can be construed on the resume, depending on the type of job, they can transform your life experience, whatever that is, in different forms. Suddenly, if you have the right person who can mold it in the right place, but it's not you. You know, it's impersonal. It's entirely artificial. So I feel that it's an engineer, and most of the people in position, they tell you, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. And you try to find out who made the rules, nobody knows, it came from upstairs. Here is upstairs. So at the end, the autonomy of the individual seems to be lost in this incredible infrastructure where nobody knows who does what, when, and how. But everybody has to conform because there are penalties and rewards. Penalties and rewards, and ignorance is not an excuse. You're going to pay for it. So it's very regimented. So at the end, the machine seems to offer more security. It's consistent, and the rules don't change at every corner. So it seems that it was natural. And when you look at education, I'm sorry to say, the very thing that there is no principle of freedom involved in it, it is not a voluntary act, it's a compulsory education with extreme penalties for mothers who couldn't keep their children at school. They got penalized, fined, enormous fine, because their sons had been in the street or somewhere or whatever. So it's very punitive, and punishment can reach any member of the family. It doesn't matter who. The child does something, the parent is going to be punished. You know? So,
Do you want to hear an answer?
yeah. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. Thank you for that point. I got a couple of things out of that. The first thing I would say is I don't know whether you're going to agree with this, but I would say I want to just start this answer by saying bureaucracy is not entirely terrible. It's often used as a kind of bulwark against kind of capricious or parochial or discriminatory, or it's the rules can sometimes help women, people of color, or whatever. You break out of the old boys network or whatever. So I just want to add that parenthetically at the start, but then I would say I completely agree with what you're saying, that the kind of regimentation can feel really powerfully dehumanizing. And that regimentation is not only coming from AI and apps, and it's actually, it predates it, as you say, in the imposition of this industrial logic on these personal jobs. And the extent to which that is true is the extent to which those jobs feel alienating and demoralizing for the people who are doing those jobs. And that actually is true in for-profit environments and nonprofit environments. Like there's a kind of culture of austerity and a culture of efficiency, and both of those impose the same kind of efficiency pressures on people who are trying to see the other, and that can really impinge. It can really impede their capacity to see these individuals and to be themselves an individual. And my people, the participants in my research, really had heartbreak about that. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Where should we go?
Well, she was next, and then there were others. Okay. And people are now getting into it. All right.
So I'd like to go in a bit of a different direction.
Yeah.
And you would address the concept of hyperconnectivity.
Okay.
As a part of the modern obsession with iPads, iPhones, all those kind of things.
Yeah.
Have you connected 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
You juxtapose children who are raised with 24-hour-a-day connectivity digitally, as opposed to, say, 100 years ago when they were connected familiarly.
Yeah.
24 hours a day, as opposed to an artificial device.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Okay, I'm going to say another. I'm going to start again. We're going to have a pattern here. Start again with the parenthetical caveat, which is the social media connections or the way technology connects people who are in very disparate locations, who are not physically co-present, actually can be a really good thing, particularly for LGBTQ people, for example, or others who are kind of isolated and maybe oppressed in their, say, rural or whatever location. They don't have kind of a community of their own. So that is, we need to kind of keep that in mind. And then at the same time, I'm going to say, but I do agree. Oh, I'm going to say one more caveat. Here's another caveat, which is the research about technology use is just not the smoking gun that we all seem to want it to be. Yeah, it's more of a mixed story, and it's hard to read. They're like tea leaves that are hard to read. It is not like, oh my God, everyone everyone who watches too much or is too much involved, they have less friends, they're lonelier, they're whatever you want to say. It's just not that obvious. And you can, if you have a survey that's reporting something super obvious, then I would question it, because there's a ton of work in this field, as you can imagine. People have been looking at this for decades, and it's not clear. It's confusing and noisy, as the statisticians would say. That said, I was talking today in a meeting that we had today about kind of the difference between friends you choose or communities, people you choose to be with and people you just are with. And we can all think of examples of that, but one example is like your neighbor, or there's a bunch of examples, but like say your neighbor, you kind of, they're next door, you've been living with them for a while, you might disagree a lot about their use of this or that, but then be like, you have a relationship and there's a lot of history there. And contrast that with affinity ties, people where you're like exactly choosing. And this is really a sign of urbanization, like the higher density, the more choices you have for people just like you. And tech is actually one more step down that line, where you could be even more picky about who you're with. And that, I always like to keep that in mind, because it's not that those connections don't matter or don't exist. It is true that people who are on social media express both more satisfaction and less satisfaction about their social lives. And so that's a confusing finding. Essentially, I think we can all explain it, though. It's like, I feel like I have all these friends, but look at what they're doing. I feel so out of it, or whatever. We can all kind of explain to ourselves the ambivalence that people express about their social lives on social media. But the point is that the kind of connections are different, just like your question was kind of getting at, like the difference between, there's going to be important differences between those, and there's something we learn when we are with people that we don't choose for whatever reason. We learn that we are not the center of the universe. We learn a certain humility about kind of being with others that you might not love in every aspect. You learn about like kind of compromise. And as I said, these are muscles that we need to exercise that I think are foundational for democracy. So yeah, thank you for your question.
I want to make sure that we get a few people in the back. And I also know that Vera has been waiting, so I'm going to...
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. I work in the labor movement. So
Right on. You should have been up here answering.
when I read your book title, I interpreted it a little different from the content.
Okay.
You have some great points.
Thank
so
you.
My question is from that frame. What would you say to someone in a position of power, like say a director of a state-sponsored healthcare system?
Okay.
Someone who has a big budget?
Yeah, great.
Someone that can make those decisions. to help them understand what a connective labor is worth and why is it worth the extra cost when they could cut their budget by 30% if they decide to implement AI nurses and doctors in their healthcare system instead of seeking this connective labor.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. I love this question because one of my, I can answer it and then I'll give you an example. So, or should I do the opposite? I'm going to just answer it. There's a ton of evidence that having that relationships drive outcomes that we care about. So just replacing the people that do these relationships with machines is not the way to go for people who care about the outcomes that a state administrator or a large administrator of a large healthcare system would care about. That said, there are tweaks to be made, and I know of actual cases where they're doing that. Like, so for example, I know that in Kaiser, that the Kaiser health system is running experiments right now with thousands of doctors in which they use AI scribes. So it kind of removes the data entry part, or not removes actually, because they still need supervision and they need editing, and it's not a perfect removal, but it reduces that data entry burden enormously. And so I haven't seen the results of that, but many doctors I know are really happy about that prospect. I also know doctors who criticize it, who say in the writing is the creativity, in the writing is the medicine. Wait, this note that it's writing, patients can see their notes, and this is not how I would characterize their. So it's kind of ruining my relationship with the patient. You know, like I've seen important criticisms, but if I were an engineer, I would be saying, we'll fix that soon, or whatever. So in my view, the head of a large connective labor organization trying to save 30% by replacing their core, the entities that provide its core function with machines is making a big error, and that's not just me saying that. There's a lot of research that shows that these people, that the relationships matter for the outcomes. It's more like, I think, more likely and more ambivalently or something, like there's more likely are these kind of augmenting or kind of adding at the margins, and that's where we need to kind of figure out whether that's a good or bad thing. I'll give you another example. I know somebody in Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. They're doing a whole study of where connective labor takes place, and they're using AI to measure it. So they are measuring interactions. I guess they have tapes. I'm recording. I'm not sure what's happening. But they are coding the interactions both for duration and for tone and some other things that I cannot remember. But they're not necessarily content because they want to avoid HIPAA violations. But they're coding it for, they're trying to measure and evaluate where those interactions are positive. And then they plan on kind of both, well, they plan on doing a number of things, but one of the things they're going to do, they say, is train the people who are doing it less well with the good examples, kind of. And they're going to also look at a kind of on a spatial analysis for like where in the hospital is it happening and where is it not and why would that be? So, yeah, I think we're at an early stage where people are still trying to figure out what this is, but the total replacement, I think, is so misguided that one is less, it just feels so, misguided to me that there's a ton of evidence suggesting that. Is that an answer to your question? It wasn't very labory, that answer or that question, so I'm not sure we got that. Come see me after if I can do that better.
Hi, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the diversity of the careers of the folks that you interviewed.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could address how it relates to the idea of the wanting to make them proud and therefore the value of judgment.
Yeah.
Because there's a huge difference in power differentiation between the kind of worker and the person working with careers. And so presumably the frisson is going to be different.
Yeah.
Those different situations.
Yeah.
And I can't shake your example of the student who doesn't want his teacher to give anything but the content of the science and math, that indicates that teaching in particular is not being seen as something that is necessarily going to produce a sense of danger, because the teacher is maybe not given the same kind of status position as perhaps the physician. So just reflecting on that.
Mm-hmm.
And corollary to that, of course, many of us here are teachers, so we're a little bit obsessed with that example.
Yeah, great.
A corollary to that is you stress so much, the importance of relationship over individualism. But at the same time, you talk to us about teaching as allowing the student to reflect back through the teacher upon themselves. When do we teach students empathy? When do we teach students how to reflect others? When do we teach students about relationships? Because in this connective labor model, in pedagogy, the pedagogue is in the position of setting aside their regulating their own emotions, reflecting back the student to them.
Yeah.
When does it become a relationship, though, where the student is also setting themselves, their individualism aside?
Yeah. Thank you. Great questions. Love them both. Okay. I'm going to take the second one first. First of all, I think that I do think these are relationships, even though they are not both disclosing to the same amount. So I do think they are relationships. I would still call them relationship. I'd still think the thing in between them is relationship. I still think it's, if not reciprocal, it is, or if it's not mutual exactly, it's like kind of deeply interactive. So I do think that. I think that the teaching of empathy, there's going to be experts who do that more than I can. I actually watched some of it happen. But I do think it starts with being seen. Like, it starts with that experience of being seen. And then I think there's probably a step 2. And that's what I'm not really going into. I feel like I've seen it, I want to say, in my daughter's preschool class. Like I've seen just kind of like, no, we don't say that here. Can you say that? Like a kind of emphasis on kindness, et cetera. I'm sure there's a reams written about this, as well as I've seen it happen. But I don't feel like I'm an expert in it. I just would say that being seen in this fashion feels to me for sure step 1. You're not going to be empathetic if you have never felt this. The other thing I would say that I really want to say all the time is that it doesn't have to be perfect. Too many people, I think, when they hear this, they worry about like getting it wrong, and actually that process is part of the process. Like that's how it works. It's like I'm going to get it wrong, but then you can fix it, and then in the fixing you'll feel even more seen, and it's a dance. But you're a teacher, you already know this. Okay, inequality, great question. So I have a whole chapter on inequality because it's very central, and also it's kind of, thank you for saying you appreciate the diversity of my respondents. I would say it's unusual for sociologists to have this wild, kind of cornucopia of participants. And I remember actually when we were when I was looking for a publisher, one publisher was like, we need just have one, and then we'll get the idea and apply it to all the others. And I was like, that's a different book, not going to do that. But that's what some people said. So it's actually a strength, I think, of this book or work that I can speak to both sides of inequality, where the seer or the connective labor practitioner has more power, say the doctors, the therapists, even the teachers, or where they have less power, and that would be like the home health care aide, or where the other person is a wealthy woman on the Upper East Side. That was a case that I talked to a worker there, and I really tried to figure out what inequality does in both directions. Like how does that work and what happens? And I wrote a whole chapter about it. Basically, I find that it kind of silences the truth-telling on which this witnessing labor depends. So you can imagine it in both ways. You can imagine that, and I had really many minutes of hours, we could say, of like physicians or teachers saying, I just want them to feel safe. My whole goal is that they feel safe so that they'll actually tell me if they don't understand the lesson, or they never eat vegetables, or they can't exercise, or so many were like, I just want to hear the story. And so they're trying to mitigate the inequality that's built into the system. But the silencing in the other direction is also a silencing. It's just a different silencing because what they say is not necessarily as truthful. So, and I got this partly because I happened in a weird way to have lunch, a group lunch with a billionaire. And I was describing my research, and he said, aren't they all just performing? And I was like, you're describing your situation. Like, I kind of was like, that must be what it's like to be a billionaire. Like, you don't know when people are telling you the truth because it's so distorted by your own situation. Like, I never thought that, or I didn't think that, because I'd been interviewing all these people, like, no, the teacher is not lying, anyway. But when I'm interviewing some of the people with less power in that situation, they are some of them are performing. I interviewed a bunch of sex workers, for example, 100% performance. I would still call it connective labor because they are still looking at the other, seeing the other, witnessing, sending that image back. The person's like, yes, that is me, like that is what I'm talking about. It just happens to be without the kind of, I would say, professionalized ethos that was animating some of the other work. So the home healthcare aid was different. I found they were more, not quite performing. They were silencing some of what they were saying, but not completely. And somehow the professional ethos about their pride in what they were doing kind of, to some degree, helped them through the built-in inequality about it. I love the question. I think it's a complicated story. Thank you.
Do you want to take one more?
Sure, I'm happy. The last word.
The last question. I feel like I asked a question my friend had, so.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think she was wondering, more on education and stuff.
Yeah.
With, kids, like students younger than me who have even more grown up in this as their context already. How do you convince them that there is this value outside of that they need as well?
Say that again in a different way. I didn't quite get it. The value outside of what?
Of using AI or staying online.
Okay, now that I know what you're talking about, say it one more time. How do you
for kids who are really used to the online AI world?
Yes.
How do you convince them that it's worth it to step outside of that and get the human connection
Yes.
that we might know, but they might be less used to?
Yes. Thank you. That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's not just your generation or the people coming up behind you or whatever, because I had doctors say, there were so many doctors telling me about how they are retiring or resigning, or my father quit because of this, or I quit, so much about quitting because it was too much what they were being asked to do. And then they told me, but the new ones don't care and they're fine with it. They were really talking about the imposition of the industrial logic on not so much about AI, but about kind of how much of their work was involving the electronic health record and being technical and and kind of interacting with the computer rather than with the patient. And they were like, this is, I went into medicine to to see patients, to really interact with them. And they were like, why did they go into medicine? I don't know. So there was a lot of intergenerational critique, I would say, happening. So I guess I have kind of two answers, and I don't know whether they're right. On the one hand, I do think that this is very powerful to be on the other end of, to feel. It is very powerful when someone sees you, and it's very powerful when they do not. I've been giving a ton of book talks over the year, and often somebody will say, will describe a moment when they have been misrecognized, and they don't forget. You do not forget that moment. It's so interesting how it haunts people. But I also think it's very powerful to be seen. And so can it be that the sheer power of the interaction of the event would motivate people to seek it out again and again, and to maybe set aside the AI, whatever? I don't know, because I also know they'll be more used to it. And especially in this moment of so little regulation, so little transparency about what is AI and what is not. They are not even required to disclose anything yet. I do think that this is going to change. In 10 years, it's going to be very different. They're going to be like, can you believe we didn't have X? So there's regulation coming, and we just, we're living in a weird moment right this second. Nonetheless, I do think young people are going to be, this is the water that they'll swim in, and it's our task to remind ourselves and each other about the importance of this work so that we preserve it and protect it for ourselves, for our democracy, and for future generations. Thank you for your question.